We're coming up to the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, and as we are in Elul now, we are already blowing the shofar, and the Torah describes the holiday of Rosh Hashanah in a couple of places. On the one hand, you have Vayikra 23. The Torah speaks of Daber b'nei Yisrael lemor b'chodesh hashvi'i de'echad lachodesh yihye lachem Shabbaton. Yes, thank you for sharing the sources there. Shabbaton. Zikhron, Teruah, Mikra, Kodesh. This is in the midst of Parshas Emor when the Torah is describing the various holidays, the various Mikra Kodesh. And there the Torah says that on the first of the 7th month, notably not the first of the first month, but the first of the 7th month, Yeh Lachem, Shabbaton, Zikhron, Teruah, Mikra, Kodesh. It is a Shabbaton. Here the translation is a day of complete rest, some sort of Shabbat. Yom Kippur is called Shabbat, Shabbaton. This is just Shabbaton. Zikhron, Teruah, Mikra, Kodesh. And what's occupied much attention over the millennia is the question of what Zikhron, Teruah means in this context. Mikra, Kodesh, we understand a sacred occasion, a sacred convocation perhaps. We understand this as well as usually being associated with Isur Malacha. Zikhron, Teruah. They translate here a sacred occasion, commemorated with loud blasts. Commemorated Zikhron, commemoration, Teruah with Teruah with loud blasts. This is one place where the Torah describes what we call Rosh Hashanah, the holiday of the first of the 7th month. In the Midbar, chapter 29, in Parshat Pinchas, the Chodesh Hashi B'echad Lachodesh, a very similar passage, Mikra Kodesh Yelachem. Here it's explicit, Kol Malacha V'adah Lo Ta'asu, you may not do any malacha. Yom Teruah Yelachem, it shall be a day of Teruah. Here the translation is a day when the horn is sounded, a day of Teruah. The term here, the missing term is Zikhron, Zikhron Teruah. So we have Zikhron Teruah in Vayikra, and in Bimidbar, Yom Teruah Yelachem. So it's a bit of a puzzle. What does it mean, Zikhron Teruah? Is there a difference between Zikhron Teruah and Yom Teruah? Are they both descriptions of are they both names, proper names for the day in some sense? Is one a description of the day and one a proper name? Is one a description of the mitzvah of the day? These are questions that have occupied the commentators for millennia at this point. Of course, in our liturgy and in our tradition, and going back for many, many years, we know that Rosh Hashanah is called Yom HaZikaron, the name taken from this passage, Zikhron Teruah, Yom HaZikaron, the day of Zikaron. It's clearly taken in our liturgy as a central term, a central description of the day. But what could it possibly mean? So if you look down, if we keep scrolling down in the sheet, we see that Shadal, Samuel David Litzato, he says simply on his commentary on Vayikra, on Amor, Zichron Teruah, Kimo Haskiru Kinisgav Shemo. He cites a verse which I actually placed it below from Isaiah 12. And you shall say in that day, Yom Hahu, and that, that day in the future eschatological day, Hodu la Hashem Kiru Shmo, Hodu Vamim Alilotav, Haskiru Kiniskav Shemo. And their understanding is Haskiru Kiniskav Shemo, make mention, or in other words, declare Kiniskav Shemo. So Shadal, going back up again, Shadal suggests that Zichron Teruah means simply Kimo Haskiru. Zichron means that you should make mention Kiniskav. You should make mention V'Hakavana Kadei Shidu Hakol Shayom Rosh Hashanah. You should announce that today is the day of which we call Rosh Hashanah. The same way he notes that another time where we blow, and there it's explicit, we blow a shofar. V'chem Shnat Hayovel Hayutokim Lahodia Shehi Shnat Hayovel. Right? They make explicit that that we blow in order to on the horns to announce, essentially, right, to signify, to ring the bells. Today is the Yovel, today is the Jubilee year. Similarly, in our case, today is Rosh Hashanah. And not to confuse it with other days. So for Shadal, Zikhron Teruah means make mention, commemorate, perhaps via the Teruah, that today is a special day. Now it's not explicit in Shadal here. Why would this day require a special commemoration and not any other holiday? Why do you not need to blow the shofar on Chag HaMatzot to announce that today is Chag HaMatzot, or on Sukkot to announce that now is Sukkot? There have been those who have suggested, by the way, that we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah to announce the upcoming holiday of Chag, the upcoming holiday of Sukkot. I'm not sure exactly what the basis for that claim is, but I have seen it. In the event, this is Shadal's understanding. Or more classically known, and here I want to present a machloket Rashi and Ramban, Rashi and Nachmanides, and try to trace through some of their interpretations and tease out some of the ramifications before we reflect more broadly on what the link might be between Rosh Hashanah and Zikhron, meaning not only commemoration or mentioning, but memory in general. I want to get to that at the end. But for now, I'll note, let me just pause for 1 second to see if I'm missing anything in the chat box. Nope, so far we are fine. Zikhron, Rashi on the verse Zikhron and Zikhron Teruah. Rashi says Zikhron Teruah, Zichron Psuke Zichronot Upsuke Shofarot. He's citing both the Midrash and the Midrash itself cited in the Gemara. Zichron Psuke Zichronos Upsuke Shofarot. The Zikhron Teruah means that we make mention of certain verses associated with the shofar, be they the verses of remembering or zichronot, commemoration, remembrance, and the verses of the shofar. And he's referring to the Midrash, which Rashi cites, is referring to the way perhaps this verse is understood by our liturgy, or maybe it's not taken only from this verse, but where our liturgy, we understand in the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, incorporates 3 passages, Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofaros. The verses speaking of God's kingship, the verses speaking of Zichronot, come back to that in just a second, and verses about Shofar, which are heavily about revelation. And about revelation. We'll return to the liturgy in just a moment. But here Rashi seems to be Zikhron Teruah as demanding that we recite these verses. Now, it's a bit of a debate. Does Rashi mean to imply that reciting the Zichronot is some kind of a biblical mitzvah, as a doraita? We understand shofar, the blowing of shofar on Rosh Hashanah to be a biblical mitzvah. At least fundamentally. There's a whole history to that mitzvah. But does Rashi seem to imply that he's interpreting the verses here in Vayikra, that Zikhron Teruah demands reciting these verses, or maybe these verses are somehow meant to recite along with the shofar? And one is reminded of Rabbi Gamliel's statement, which is cited in the Haggadah, actually, that whoever does not say these 3 things, Pesach Matzah Marar, Lo Yatzai Dei Chovato, which some understand to mean has not fulfilled the mitzvah of eating matzah, or eating maror, of eating the carbon Pesach, that along with the act, the ritual eating act, which those mitzvahs enjoy, and there is a speech act which has to accompany them. So that's possible that Rashi here is claiming that in addition, on the biblical level, fundamentally, a prat in the kiyum, as we'd say, that is a part and parcel of fulfilling, at least in the fullest sense, fulfilling the mitzvah of shofar is reciting these verses as well. That's an interesting possibility. Others understand Rashi here, or the Midrash itself, to be speaking in sort of a homiletic sense. Asmachta ba'alma doesn't mean literally that it's a deraisa to recite the zichronot along with the along with the shofar. But they certainly are associated, right? As the Midrash, as the Gemara has it, right? You should, anoint me malchiyot, and you should cause me to remember you. And how? With the shofar, right? So there's a sense that the two are fundamentally, they're meant to come together, meant to be performed together, and the two elements of the mitzvah are the two elements of the mitzvah are indeed two elements of one mitzvah rather than two separate features entirely. And indeed, again, if we return to the Musaf liturgy for Rosh Hashanah, so this is not in your sources, but we do see this again in the Zichronot section of the Musaf. Let's open up my Machzor here. Where it begins after Malchiyot, which incorporates within it the Kedushat Hayom HaKadosh Yisrael Hayom HaZikaron Ata Zocher Ma'asei Olam Ufoked Kol Yitzurei Kedem. God remembers all; nothing is hidden from God. The sense of God sitting on the throne of Din, the throne of judgment, before whom nothing is forgotten. Right? All is there. Actually, I remember years ago hearing, Moshe Halber made an interesting point that the very act of vidoy, the very act of confessing, is kind of paradoxical because it incorporates within it the assumption if you have to confess, it sort of implies that God does not already know. But in truth, God does know all, right? That's part of the notion of God. God knows already. God knows already what you did. God knows your inner being, your interiority is not hidden from God. And therefore, in the very act of vidor, there's some amount of transgression, but some sort of paradox. And even here, God, right, sees all from all generations. And in our recitation of Zichronot, we have Zecher kol maasim b'lefanecha. You are doresh maaseh kulam. You seek out all of them. And the verses themselves, which I don't spend too much time on here, but are very illustrative in terms of how the Siddur understands, the Machzor understands the nature of Zichronot, right? Because which verses are cited? This comes already from referenced already in the Talmud. Which verses count as Zichronot, which don't count as Zichronot. And I will say that the Talmud has a debate: does the verb pakad count as a Zichronot? Hashem pakad et tzara. Whether it does or not, whether it does or doesn't count, some machloket in the Gemara there. But certainly it's cited as one of our Torah readings for the day. So assumedly, whoever put that together might have had that in mind as well. Or not only Hayom Harat Olam and announcements of birth and etc. and everything else that happens in those readings, but also the remembrance itself. The act of being poked. They're in a positive sense. We also have Noach, right? One of the first, perhaps the first remembrances in the Torah, in the Chumash, where God remembers, and remembers in that sense is an act of mercy, an act of reclaiming, if you will, right? God remembers Noach and all those who are with him, and causes the waters to recede, in parallel to Egypt, where God hears the cries of the Israelites. He remembers the Israelites, remembers the covenant, Zacharti Priti, and that's indeed the Chatima. You remember all, nothing is forgotten from you. Baruch atah Hashem zocher habrit. So Zichron, in the sense of God who is remembering not only all of our deeds in the sense of judgment, but also God who remembers in a covenantal manner, as an act of relationship. We're not foreign to God. Zacharti lahem brit rishonim. Right? God remembers us and takes us back. So the shofar, the Zichron Teruah here in the liturgy, is understood not only as an act of judgment, but also an act of reclaiming and relationship. And going back to the Rashi here on the source sheet, Zichron Psuke Zichronot Psuke Shofarot Lizkor Lehem Akedat Yitzchak Shekarav Tachtav Ayel. Right, to remember for them, here's the second piece of the Rashi, the Akedah, to remember that Isaac offered an ayil, or a ram, right, whose horn would be called via the shofar. And this is also captured in the liturgy. Akedat Yitzchak Lezaro Hayom Rachamim Tizkor. Remember today, Zikhron Teruah. Remember today the Akedah. Right, bring to mind, God, the horn on that ram caught in the thicket, and Abraham, who offered Isaac. And that's a very powerful image, and we're thinking about more broadly what the connection might be between the Akedah itself, which is also recited, of course, the Akedah itself, and why that needs to be remembered on Rosh Hashanah. Right. Now this notion of Machos and Zichronos and Shofarot being referenced in Zikhron Teruah, like I say, it comes from the Gemara, but the Gemara has more understandings as well, which I think are important to bring to bear here. So if you look at the source from Rosh Hashanah 29b on the sheet, this is what the Gemara is talking about, the question of whether or not we blow shofar. The Mishnah is talking about, do we blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah? Rosh Hashanah, Shechol Yot b'Shabbat. Right. So our practice, generally speaking, as far as I know everyone here, is that we don't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, which falls onto Shabbat. And there's a long history of that. In the Mikdash, and they did blow shofar on Shabbat, on Rosh Hashanah b'Shabbat. In Yavna as well. Throughout history, there were places which continued to blow. There's a whole history to that, but in most places where we don't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, Shechol Yot b'Shabbat. So the Gemara here, I'm citing it from the Bavli, but the Talmud Yerushalmi has this as well, and this is often sort of cited as a machloket Bavli Yerushalmi, a debate between the Bavli and the Babylonian Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud, Palestinian Talmud. So the Gemara there says, Minahani Mili. So there's a tradition, Amar Levi Barchama, or Elachma, Amar Echama Barchanina. Well, it says, Katuv Echad Omer Shalaton Zichron Teruah, Katuv Echad Omer Yom Teruah Yelachem. One place it says, we saw in Vayikra, it says, calls it Zichron Teruah, but it calls it Yom Teruah Yelachem. Lo kasha, kam Yom Tov Shechol b'Shabbat, kam Yom Tov Shechol Yot b'Chol. So this tradition says, the verse which says Zichron Teruah is talking about a day where there's merely a memory, or mention, of the Teruah, but not a proper Teruah itself, is to say that shofar is not blown. That's understood to be, remember, Shabbaton, Zichron Teruah, day of Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, which is on Shabbat. Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbat, we only have a Zichron Teruah. We don't have a Teruah proper. While Yom Teruah Yelachem is understood to mean Rosh Hashanah, which falls like this year, I believe Shabbat is Rosh Hashanah is Shabbat and Sunday. On Shabbat we won't blow shofar, Zichron Teruah, but on Sunday Yom Teruah Yelachem, we will blow the shofar. That is Yom Tov Shechol Yot b'Chol. Again, whether this is a serious derivation or a playful asmachta derivation is, I guess up for debate. But if you take it seriously, that means that the notion that we don't blow shofar on Shabbat is a d'oraita exemption. That d'oraita we don't blow the shofar on Shabbat, and that's one possibility. However, Rava, the Babylonian Amor Rava, challenges on a couple of grounds, including he says that if it was really an exemption or an exception on the biblical level, fundamental exemption that we don't blow the shofar on Shabbat, even Rosh Hashanah, Shechol Yot b'Shabbat, then why would you blow it in the Mikdash? It should be a fundamental rule wherever you are, that you don't blow the shofar on Shabbat at all. And therefore he says it's actually just a rabbinic decree for technical reasons, right? We're afraid that people will end up carrying the shofar in a public space. And for that reason, we also don't shake the lulav on Shabbat, etc. We don't read the Megillah on Shabbat because we don't want to engage in those things on Shabbat, lest people violate a rule. Again, there's a whole history to this, but what you see here is potentially, depends on how you read it, a debate whether or not the exemption from reading the blowing the shofar on Shabbat is deraita or derabana. It's fundamental or is not fundamental. Is actually only on the rabbinic only on the rabbinic level. Okay. If it is only on the rabbinic level, then you are left wondering again, what does Zikhron Teruah mean? It doesn't come to exempt one from blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah Shabbat. So what could it mean? And you're left perhaps to return back to Rashi's reading. However, there is another option, and that is a whole other view, and that is the view of Nachmanides of the Ramban. And I'll get to him in a second, but you'll see first in Numbers 10 that there are interesting parallels to this language of Zikhron, including associated with Teruah in the Chumash, and Ramban notes himself, and this is an extremely important parallel or analogous passage from Bamidbar 10, where the Torah says that when you are at war in your land, right, and you will blow. Here the verb is blow b'chatzotrot, with trumpets, interestingly, right? Not with what we call a shofar, but I'm not going to get into here now the distinction between shofar and chatzotrot. But there it says, we shall blow on these instruments. V'nizkartem l'fnei Hashem Elokechem, and you shall be remembered before this. That is saying God's cognizance, as it were. And you'll be saved from your enemies. So the Ramban points to this passage and notes that at the beginning of this passage and notes the language of Bahariotem and Vinizkartem, but there the Nizkartem, you will be, is clearly meant to mean that you'll be remembered by Nizkartem National Kechem. You'll be remembered, brought to the attention, as it were, of God, and you'll be saved. And you can imagine, bringing that imagery onto Rosh Hashanah, right? That we are somehow in a time of distress or existential, it's not crisis, but existential, on some existential precipice, and we require that we be remembered by God. Here, the assumption seems to be that remembrance in front of God, again, is some sort of positive connotation, right? Zocher habrit, or something along those lines. And you'll be saved, right? So you put that into Rosh Hashanah, and perhaps Zikhron Teruah, the Ramban will argue, is associated with these functions, right, of the blowing of the shofar, that we be remembered in front of God. It's interesting about in the passage that on festive days as well, on festive days you have a tekiah blast, if you will, along with your offerings. And they will be a reminder of you before your God. They I assume again is the blowings which accompany the olot and the zitzchei shalmechem and the karbanot. So the Ramban notes, and here I'm scrolling down again to Zikhron Teruah. Zikhron Teruah, he says, Kemo Yom Teruah Yelachem. It's the same thing as the passage in the Midbar 29. It's not talking about it doesn't mean anything different. It's the same type of mitzvah. Yomar Shenariya B'Yom Hazeh. We should blow on this day. But he elaborates, Zikhron Teruah means it will be for us, it will enact some sort of zikaron, remembrance of us in front of God, right? The great fear of being forgotten by God in one sense or another. Not so much forgotten that God doesn't, remember, like we forgot our keys somewhere, but that we will have been forgotten. We're not of import. We're not worthy. We don't have a relationship, right? God is forgetting the covenant. Right? So to remember us, God remembers us, takes heed of us, cares for us, saves us. And as he goes on, he says that, I'm just scrolling along, skipping the parts about chasotzot and shofarot. And he says why. He says later on. He says lo perish hakatuv tam mitzvah azot. The Torah does not articulate why did we need to do this. Why do we need Teruah? Why do we need Zikhron on this particular day more than any other day? I would add on any other day, any other holiday even. Right? Why would God make this a special day? So he essentially says that it's because it's meant to precede Yom Kippur, and here we have in mind our whole journey of not only forget Elul but Rosh Hashanah, and then the 10 days of repentance, and then leading into Yom Kippur, the Day of Judgment. So for him, the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is a way of enacting or ensuring Zikhron in front of God as God judges us at the beginning of this season, and He should judge us favorably as we lead into Yom Kippur. So this is a well-known machloket Rashi and Ramban. Assumingly, by the way, that regarding our question before, does Rashi mean that Zichronot, which are in the Musaf liturgy, are deoraita? So maybe he meant that, maybe he didn't, but Ramban certainly does not seem to think this, and I believe elsewhere as well. Sefer Mitzvot, Ramban is clear about this as well, that the Zichronot reciting along with the shofar are not deoraita, or certainly not deoraita in some absolute sense. They are, the Zichron here is referring to not our mentioning of Zichronot, but rather our attempt to be remembered by God, right? That the worst thing is to have been forgotten, and this way we are attempting so much to be remembered. There is a different path here, which I think is interesting. And that is to say that the remembrance we're talking about so far up to this point has been basically God's remembrance, right? Zichron Teruah, it's our making mention or our commemoration or our declaring the day. But in terms of memory proper, it's really about God remembering the Akedah, God remembering us, Lifnei Hashem, God remembering, taking heed of us, and in a way, in saving us, right, as we approach the Yom Hadin, or during the Yom Hadin, and the 10 days of repentance and Yom Kippur. There is another angle which I think is worth delving into, and this shir, by the way, looks like we will go a little bit shorter than the full time allotted, but I'll pause towards the end, and maybe we can unmute and have some discussion. I see people are chatting, but I can't look at those as I'm talking here. Yeah, okay. So Rav Sensenfall Hirsch has the following comments, which I thought were evocative. He says on Parshat Damor, Hayom Hanidom Psugatino Eno Yom Zikaron Lamatanot Shekibanu Hashem Elohu Yom Hamazmino Tam Avoda Latzmino. So Hirsch says, you think about Rosh Hashanah as opposed to, let's say, Pesach, Chag HaMatzot, Pesach or Chag HaMatzot, or Sukkot, even Shavuot, Bikurim. It's not a day that we are trying to remember or make mention of the gifts that we received from God. Received in the past tense, received yearly, right, which is, I think about also the rabbinic holidays of Purim or Hanukkah, days which are commemorating miracles, days that Jewish people receive something from God. He says, no, hu yom hamazmino tanu la'avoda latzmenu. This is a day which is inviting us not so much to remember and in gratitude historical events and good things that God gave us, but rather which invites us to work on ourselves. Hamazmino tanu la'avoda latzmenu. What are the mitzvot of the day, after all? Not the Pesach, not matzah, not maror, not the sukkah, not the arba minim, not bikurim. Mitzvot hayom hu Shabbaton. So when we don't do melacha, lachdol, nifulotino. Again, this, by the way, I believe he wrote this if I remember correctly, he wrote this in German, actually not in Hebrew, but this is a translation, I think. So you can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. Lachdol Pilateno Manika Tzura Lo'olam Yotzeret et Atidatenu. Day which invites us to, to cease from work, and to, placing our stamp on the world. Instead, Zikhron Teruah. And he says Teruah. He says also, like Ramban, he points to Numbers 10. Mukarat lanu b'sefer b'midbar, kasher hu mufanit Moshe el ha'am. When Moshe says to the people, so this is a different verse actually than Ramban cites. Excuse me. That Moshe says to the people, he owed the masa machana, that when you blow the Teruah, people should travel, right? And make their way on the move. And then in the verse that we cited, he owed la azara umasa yeshua, and it is a signal, or maybe we'd say some sort of attempt to garner salvation from God. He called hamilavet sakala lazara kuma Hashem v'tzayvecha. It's a call to God to join us, to save us. Heim korim l'maaseh hitarvut asher b'kol l'shanot et ha'matzav ha'kayam. And essentially he says is that the shofar, which is formed by the human being, is essentially, right, meant to signify the work that we need to do to change our own situations, to move, to travel. If I might sort of be doresh what he's saying here, to travel, to change. And that is the import of the blowing of the shofar proper. Teruah is an oath l'chazar tam shel Hashem v'nechasim miba'alut chitzonit, right? It's a return, it signifies return, thinking of Yovel in the Jubilee year, I guess, a return from external ownership, from a sense of who, that we think we own in the world. We leave our property, leave our achuzah. Mazmina to lashuv, it calls us back to return to our primary world, our primary plot. And he goes and he goes on to say further. So he's being homiletic here, but I think it's really interesting that the Teruah he refers to here is a call to the human being, right, to return to who the human being really is, to their land, to their space, to their, maybe we go on and say who they truly are. And then the Zikaron, you could take it one step further, would be a Zikaron, which is mazkir, which reminds the person, right, of not only reminds God of the covenant, but reminds the person of our commitment to the covenant, reminds the person of their highest ideals, reminds the human being of who they really are, who they could be. And those are the parts of us, I think, which are so easily forgotten in the course of the year, in the course of all of our daily travails and such, who we really are, who we want to be, who we once dreamed of being. It's so easily forgotten. So I would suggest also that Zikhron Teruah, it's not only reminding God of God's promises, reminding God of us, of who we are, but in a sense, somehow it reminds us of who we are as well. It's a call to return in that sense. It's a Yom Zikhron Teruah, Yom HaZikaron. And I'll actually conclude my thoughts here, and maybe I'll pause and see if people want to jump in through the chat, or we're a small enough group that I don't know if you have the ability to unmute, but happy to talk. With the words of the Zohar, the final source, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Tiv Zikhron Teruah. What does it mean, Zikhron Teruah? Zikaron Adinan Lachavna Liba Ureuta. We do Zikaron to be mechavein, to direct our hearts and our intentions. Yisrael Avdinan Zikaron Latata. Begin the Itar Milah Kahugavdin La'ela. Israel, performs this act of Zikhron below in order that it should arouse the Zikhron in mirror and in parallel above. And so the Zohar is, I think, really interesting, right? The Zohar, Zikhron Teruah, what's this sort of, I think what they're playing with here is a sense that our Teruah, in a sense, is a reflection or a mirror. It's a symbol pointing to another Zikhron, if you will. That our Teruah is an attempt to theologically move that which happens above, so that when we remember, God remembers as well. When we blow, God blows as well, and the relationship is healed. There actually are piyutim which play with this, the correlation, or at least association between the terms Teruah and re'ut, right, and friendship and fellowship, in a sense that blowing the shofar might bring us all, bring the human and the divine together, to return them to beloved friendship and camaraderie, to rectify a relationship which during the course of time might have become, not as tight, right? And to bring them back together. So the memory of the person, therefore, is meant to trigger and parallel the memory of the divine above. And that would bring these different readings together, that we have our memory and God's memory. And the hope is that on Rosh Hashanah, by engaging the shofar, the day of Zikhron Teruah, Yom HaZikaron, Machal Zichron HaShofar, etc., and the act of tshuva, which those are associated with, we remember. I would say we remember, among other things, our highest ideals and our hopes and dreams for ourselves and others, and in doing so, begin ditar mila kahugad leila, somehow triggers and makes us worthy of being remembered above as well. Okay, let me pause here. If people have any comments or otherwise, you can chat them. And I see Nissan's, trying to read Nissan's comments here. Trying to talk about how do take Zikhron seriously. Right. So that's what I mentioned. It's Machlokes Bavli Yerushalmi. I'm not sure. I see your question, the second question, Nissan. I'm not sure it's to make. I'm not sure. I see in the chat box. Okay. Looks like people are thinking. So I can't see your faces, many of you, but it's been nice learning with you, and wishing everybody a productive rest of Elul and meaningful shofar blasts.